So this was a podcast that I did with Tim Marshall, and I reached out to Tim on Twitter at the beginning of the year because I had read his book as a gift that was given to me over Christmas, and it was one of these amazing moments of synchronicity where this idea that's been so front of my mind for such a long time just sort of falls into your lap as a perfectly formulated book, and I loved it. It was such an entertaining read, and Tim was very generous by giving us an hour of his time. We spoke about China, we spoke about Taiwan, we spoke about Australia, we spoke about the Arctic, we spoke about Russia, we spoke about war journalism, because Tim, actually, I should give his biography, his profile a little bit. He's a British journalist and was formerly the diplomatic editor and foreign affairs editor for Sky News. Okay, so Tim is a very serious journalist, or at least, he was in a former life. And in total, he had over 24 years at Sky News. He reported from the Balkan countries and the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. He spent the majority of the 1999 Kosovo crisis in Belgrade. He was one of the few Western journalists to report from the main targets of NATO bombing raids. He was reporting from the northern African countries during the Arab Spring uprise, and he has so many other feathers to his cap just in that part of his career alone. He went on to author the subject of this conversation, the international bestseller Prisoners of Geography, and he's authored 6 books in total. He's got another one coming out in the future. He was such an easy guy to talk to. He has a great sense about him. So I had such a good time in this chat. You might feel that I sort of rushed a lot of parts of it, but that's because I did. I wanted to fit a 3-hour chat into 1 hour. Hopefully he gives us a chance and comes back around in April when he starts promoting his new book, and we can do a proper deep dive into the ideas of Prisoners of Geography, into geopolitics, into him himself. I mean, we can talk about foreign correspondence today, the changing landscape. Is it going to be blogs? Is it going to be YouTubers? Is it going to be individual content creators that are out there creating this great news, or is it still going to be coming from the big platforms themselves? Okay, so before we bring Tim into the conversation, I just want to remind you all to subscribe to the podcast. Take up your phone, swipe it up, and just press that subscribe button. The absolute hardest thing for me to be doing over here in content creation is the discovery, and pump your good juice into the algorithm. Put your energy into the algorithm, whether it's the YouTube algorithm, the podcast algorithm, or reading the blog online. Leave a review, subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and let's see if we can get geopolitics trending somehow, because I think this is a subject that is endlessly fascinating and needs to be distributed much further. So too much preamble, here we go. My conversation with Tim Marshall. Before we get into the book, I want to actually ask you about your career as a journalist. I suppose maybe you still are technically, but beforehand, through and through, bleeding journalist, and you had a wonderfully fascinating career, it looks like. But basically, I just want to say that your bio as a diplomatic editor for Sky News is littered with exciting, hairy, and I'm sure very interesting experiences. Just to name a few, you're reporting from Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia during the Balkan Wars in the 90s. You reported from the front lines in the invasion of Afghanistan. I'd like to know what it means by the front lines. But then also you were reporting from many of the northern African nations during the Arab Spring uprising, and I'm sure many, many more fascinating experiences as well. But before we get into the geography, the geopolitics, I wanted to ask you, did you think when you were a boy that you would sort of be going on these adventures? Like, how much did you romanticize the foreign journalist?
Oh, very much so. When I was about 10 or 11, I heard the BBC radio D-Day landing recordings, and the sort of very posh, tromly-womdly voice rap. And now we're just approaching the beach, and it's sort of very crackly, and you can hear guns fly. And of course, when you're a kid, it's comic book stuff. You don't know the reality that there's people, getting their limbs ripped off. So yes, I mean, I will admit to having a romantic view of it and a bit of a wanderlust. I never thought I could ever do it. I left school at 16 and did various things, but eventually got into it in the 20s. And I never lost that romanticism. Well, I started to lose it shortly before I quit, which is a good reason to quit. Never really lost the romantic side of it, but realized fairly early on, there's a rather harder reality to it. But it was those BBC recordings of the D-Day landings. I thought, that sounds fun. I mean, of course it wasn't, but as a 10-year-old, that sounds fun.
Yeah. If I put myself in your younger shoes for a minute, huge influences on me are men like Christopher Hitchens, who obviously did a lot of foreign journalism, and I really romanticize that as well. So it's funny, the sort of difference in generation. You have the D-Day
But
landing through
there
the
is a
radio.
romanticism to it, isn't there, Ryan? Because you are going to what to us are strange places and
Adventure.
meeting really interesting people, and it is not a reporting job. It's not a 9 to 5 job. You said at the beginning, maybe I'm still a journalist. Sort of. I mean, I'm more a sort of analytical writer, an accessible analytical writer now. I'm not a reporter anymore. I don't go and see and tell,
Sure.
which is the classic idea of a journalist. I mean, there's many different roles. There's sub-editors, and they are very, very clever in what they do, many of them.
Yeah.
But the classic idea of the journalist is the reporter.
You hinted at maybe it maybe being an over romanticized lifestyle. So I do want to get to that. But before, you said you stopped school at 16 and then you sort of just got into it. I mean, what's the gap in the middle there like? Did you have professional qualifications, or did just this serendipitous chance come around and all of a sudden, wow, I'm learning from someone and doing it?
To a degree, you make your own luck, but serendipitous chance. I was working on the building sites. I was a painter and decorator, very good at snow cementing. Then I joined the forces. It was 4 years in the RAF. And then I came out and I was in London, unemployed. And I was doing a French conversation course at night school. Just, it was free in those days.
Okay.
And I bumped into a woman that worked at LBC Radio. Told her my dreams, and she gave my handwritten CV to someone that needed a sort of T-boy, basically, at LBC Radio, which was on Fleet Street. And there is no way in hell, this is the luck side, there's no way in hell if I just sent that CV in, probably badly spelt, not an ounce of experience,
Yep.
that I would have it would have gone straight in the bin. It's because it was handed to this woman who probably, hopefully, God willing, said, look, interesting lad, have a look at him.
Yeah.
So it was chance, and that it was a 3-day gig, and it turned into 30 years.
Wow, that's so amazing. These days, I imagine that sort of line of getting into an industry, whether it's foreign journalism, I suppose it is possible if the right person is sort of doing the handing over, I imagine.
Still happens, but it's a problem in journalism, because when I got into it, there was an incredibly eclectic mix of public school, which in the British sense means privately educated, and working class barra boys from East London. It was an amazing mix, and it really gelled together and worked. Whereas now, to get in, certainly international journalism, certainly in the UK and definitely in America, you have to be at one of the best universities and be academically good, as well as having other. I'm not saying that it's easy for these people, but they're the only ones who seem to be getting in. Very few people get in at shop floor level, at T-boy level, and it's a problem, because it's another way in which the newsroom does not reflect the audience to which it's broadcasting or reporting.
I suppose there is, I mean, a lot of questions are bubbling to mind about trying to speak about what, say, your take is on journalism now, and maybe what foreign journalism might look like going into the future. But I think it would drag too much time away from the crux of what we really want to talk about.
Well, there's still some great work being done. I wish there was more storytelling, but there's still some great work being done. And what I have said to younger people coming in is, never listen to old geezers like me saying, "Oh, you've missed the golden age."
Yeah,
it's always the golden age, because journalism can be great fun.
What are some of the downsides to the line of work? I think the upsides are perfectly clear, but perhaps you want to talk about some of the downsides.
Downsides are, for most people, it's not that well paid. You really got to get to a certain level before it's a well-paid job. The hours, the expectations, because although it's slightly softer now, I think, than it used to be a couple of decades ago, certainly at national news level, there is an expectation of, what do you mean you've done 12 hours and you're going home? The story's still on. No. And obviously you can leave the newsroom and go home, or you can say, I'm not coming in on my weekend off. But you do that too many times, and
You
you're
don't,
just
you miss the
beaten.
promotion. Yeah.
It's hard, and you really have to give up quite a lot. I mean, I've nearly missed my own wedding
Christ.
because I was in Serbia during the war. It's tough, and it requires a certain dedication and sacrifice, and that is just the expectation.
Mm.
Stress, sometimes moral judgment, sometimes am I doing the right thing, comes into it, especially out in the field. But, there is a weak bit, but, you could say that of many of those things of many jobs. So I'm not complaining about it.
Oh, but it carries more weight in, I suppose, your line of work when you're seeing something and experiencing it and then sort of watching the conversation about it being totally different around the rest of the world. I imagine that as a frustration
Yes.
might be immense.
Well, it is. I mean, I used to come back to the newsroom during the Balkan Wars with a nickname Marshallowitz, because I'd spent a lot of time on the Serbian side and in Serbia and on the Bosnian Serb, not on their side, but with them, reporting on them and explaining their point of view. And the narrative at the time was very much that the Bosnian Muslims were victims, as indeed they were, and the Serbs were the aggressors, as indeed they were. But it just wasn't as simple as that. So I chose to try and explain a viewpoint. And of course, you then get accused of being on the wrong side.
Yeah.
And again, it happened in Syria. I chose to try and explain the government and those that supported the government, because half the country actually did, explain why they felt the way they did. And of course, some people think, well, you're supposed to be saying that they're the bad guys, and it's just not the way I ever tried to work. So there's that pressure. But I'll tell you a little quick story. There's also this moral pressure, especially when you're trying to make a name. I covered a ferry sinking in Finland, 700 dead, a really awful, terrible story. And I got to the hospital after some of the competitors who'd been getting lots of pictures, and there was hardly anything. And an ambulance pulled up, and people were pushed out and dead into the hospital. And I just assumed they were from the ferry. And we were driving off, and I realized I'm going to put these pictures on saying they're from, and I don't know. So I went back to check, and they said, no, this was something else. So I still didn't have any pictures. And I remember feeling this real pressure. Well, just put them on. And I mean, luckily I didn't.
Yeah.
But, things like that happen, and some people succumb to that pressure, and they're not bad people, but you need to have that strength of character to take the bollocking from the boss that you didn't get the story.
And I imagine
you cannot cross that line.
And I imagine when you're in a war zone or a very hairy sort of happening in a developing nation where there isn't any oversight and you can kind of decide your own story.
It's been done by some. It's been. I won't join in the dissing of him, even though privately I do. And he's passed away, and some people might work it out. But there is a very well-known correspondent who didn't make it up.
Oh, yeah.
Knowing it couldn't be checked. Very well known. Like I said, I don't want to join in dissing by name. But I remember when I first got into it, there was these legendary stories, which apparently were true, of reporters. The most famous one from a television one was a guy who had filmed a woman shrieking in agony because her child had been pulled dead from an earthquake rubble. But he got to the satellite station, which is like a 2 or 3 hour drive, and he was told this story from London. It's an amazing story, 50 miles from where he'd been, of this woman crying with joy as her child is pulled alive. And he used the same pictures and said they were of.
So the one photo could convey both emotions.
Yeah.
Oh,
he used the footage he got of a woman crying in grief as the story of the amazing 3-day.
Wow.
It used
and I imagine a lot of that happens.
I think it happens less.
Less so now, I suppose. Maybe more oversight. Yeah. I mean, who knows? Look, you kind of left a little carrot there about a fun story about almost missing your wedding. Though I do want to reemphasize the time. Is it a fun little story to tell?
No.
Okay.
I was in Serbia. I was one of 2 British journalists that stayed because we were all expelled. And I knew if I left, I won't go into how I stayed there, but I knew if I left, I may not be able to get back. And I was the only one of just 2 Brits there. In fact, only 3 Western reporters there, I think. But I'd made some good contacts, and I said, look, I'm getting married. And they said, all right, go on. You can come back. So that's it. I made it with 1 day to spare, and I went back a couple of days later.
Did the missus know that you had made a decision where it wasn't certain that you could make it on time?
I was going back.
Yeah, okay.
Got to get your priorities right.
Worked out, yeah, certainly. All right, look, let's move on to the book, Tim. Prisoners of Geography specifically. So I was gifted this book on Christmas, and I really just had the most glorious couple of days sitting in front of the Boxing Day Test match, reading it. It was fantastic. I am afraid that because of the scope of geopolitics, a lot of it kind of gets lost, because for me, the interesting part is looking at the macro view, looking what shifting power looks like, what sort of underdog influences could topple the favorite. What does an infrastructure project really mean? I don't know, these sort of questions. You probably have a much better insight into me as to why geopolitics isn't, kind of one of the primary themes of the very popular podcasts or maybe more popular books and so forth. I suppose yours is an exceptional outlier to the idea of maybe geopolitics not being an extremely popular field, but nonetheless, I think a really cool way to sort of introduce it as an exciting topic would to be for you to talk about the Arctic. We look at it through the lens of the Arctic, because it's the last chapter of the Prison of Geography, and you give a brilliant overview of what's going on up there at the moment by analyzing this seemingly unimportant, boring, and uninhabitable giant sheet of ice. But the truth is that there's a lot more happening there. So can you give us some flavor and maybe explain what's happening in the Arctic?
You mentioned geopolitics and the macro, and I agree with you. I think a macro view, especially for a general audience, is essential. But I also think that if you want to give the macro view, you better know the micro view as well, because I don't think you can do one without the other. It's when you have drilled down to a certain level. I'm not an academic expert. You can then do macro, because if you don't get the detail, you don't get the wider view as well. On the Arctic, again, I don't know how micro this is, but it's worth knowing in the Arctic. When I wrote this book 5 years ago, the figures are more or less the same because I've looked them up recently. Russia's got 28 icebreakers, and America's got 2. That's tiny little detail, but when you know that, and then you know how many troops Russia has in the Arctic, how many cities it has in it, etc., etc. It's very easy to then get the macro view that if there's going to be a competition in the Arctic, I think I know who's going to win it. And it's going to be Russia.
Is that even taken into account all of the NATO icebreakers as well? From memory, I think there was maybe Finland at 8, Norway had a few. Them together as a force, or?
Yeah, no, but they don't have the right and the jurisdiction to be up there. Off the 200 miles of exclusive economic zone, off the coast of Russia, and Russia, again, you just look at the map and you see they've got half the Arctic, and they claim more than they've actually legally got. So it's this alleged wasteland, and yet it isn't. And it's worth getting a map that looks top down at the Arctic. Classically on a world map, it's up there. A map of Europe. In Britain, we see, Britain's here, Europe's there, and there's the Arctic up there. But if you do a top down, you see it's this big round lake, ocean. And then you see which people that border it. I think it's 7 or 8 nations. And that's when I go back to these things about the micro, like 28 icebreakers versus 2, how many troops they've got, how many bases they've got. So Russia is in a much better position to take advantage of 2 things that's happening, both because of global warming. One is access to the oil and the gas. There is, so much up there. You can't get at it because of the climate, but if it becomes more attainable, they will get it. They will attempt to get it. And, given that their coastline is so long, their 200 miles of exclusive economic zone is obviously a lot more than everybody else's combined. And then the second thing is the trade routes. If the northern route opens up 12 months a year that ships can go through it, then they're going to be stopping at ports, and they're going to be dropping off and getting goods and equipment, and you charge money for that. And so Russia will have that as a cash cow, and other trade routes will slightly diminish. Cairo, Egypt, for example, Suez Canal, slightly. So Russia is very well positioned that if the climate modeling is correct, they will take advantage of it. The other Arctic countries, Canada, they have a lot of experience, but they have a smaller population, smaller GDP, not than Russia, but certainly than America. And it was Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, that said, we have villages on the Arctic, they have cities. And it's true that they do. So it's been 5 years since I wrote that, and it has all happened very, very slowly. There has been more and more economic interest in there. The big energy companies are up there. But it's slow. But Russia, if you look at Russia's militarization of it, they have begun to open up, I think, more than 12 of the bases that they snowballed, that they mothballed when they didn't have any money at the end of the Cold War. After '89, they mothballed all these Arctic bases, but they're beginning to open them up again. And there's a reason for that, and we've just been through them.
Do you think that it's is it, assuming the climate modeling was perhaps wrong or slower, is it still possible that access to technology could give access then to the oil and the trade routes nonetheless, and therefore it is as important? Because you could, if you look at it at a big macro view, the way that many policy responses are very sluggish to the response of climate change is because you can't definitively say the model is going to be right. And therefore that might be an excuse for, say, the US and Canada and maybe Northern Europe to be like, well, we're actually going to take it as seriously as Russia is. Whereas Russia has, they've got a much worse hand, don't they? So they kind of have to put their chips into one or two big buckets. Whereas,
and they have, Putin has put a hell of a lot of chips into the Arctic, and also you will not find an American president or a British prime minister, well, we're not an Arctic nation, a Norwegian political leader making the sort of bold statements that Putin makes about the Arctic and about the riches that they say they're going to get from it. They are betting heavily on it, and you can follow the money, as the old Watergate saying was. And when you follow the money of what Russia is spending it on, it's spending it on nuclear-powered icebreakers, on oil exploration from their big, huge energy companies. And when you look at their Arctic brigades, where you look at where they're putting missiles, how they're opening up these bases, they are putting chips. They're confident, and already, I mean, when I wrote 5 years ago, I think 1 or 2 ships had gone through in the 2-month gap that there was, but now it's a regular occurrence. It's not a major world trade route yet, but it's certainly more and more people are looking at it, and more ships are going along the northern route across the top of the world.
Yeah, it's funny, some of the details of what Russia has been doing to try and win soft power over the region. Like they wanted to get the ocean renamed the Russian Ocean.
That's right.
They planted a titanium flag.
That's right.
Whatever
Still
it was.
there, as far as we know.
Exactly. So right at the point of the North Pole under the ocean. I mean, and then they tried claiming that the Siberian shelf or something was like sovereignty of Russia, and this kind of made its way half into the.
There is a legal argument to be made about that. It's the Lon-Somerov continental shelf that does stick out from underneath Siberia, and it does extend right into almost the middle of the Arctic Ocean. And there is a legal argument that gives you more jurisdiction, but it will not stand up in a court. The EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, nearly every country in the world abides by those. As far as I know, Russia accepts them. As an aside, it's a similar debate. At the moment, Turkey is claiming it has a continental shelf that comes out from the Turkish mainland into the Aegean and further into the Med. And it's using that as its claim against Greece and Cyprus, because all sorts of gas and oil have been found, especially off the coast of Cyprus.
Sure.
And so Turkey is saying, which doesn't recognize EEZs. Turkey recognizes the concept of the continental shelf, and it's using that as its legal basis for putting its survey ships and indeed warships in what are essentially Cypriot sovereign waters.
Oh, okay. That makes things delicate, doesn't it?
Oh, it got so delicate last year, and France is very much supporting Cyprus as an EU ally on this.
Okay.
There's a related issue which comes to Libya. The Libyan government in Tripoli, which Turkey supports, not the opposition government, and the Turkish government have made an agreement that they have that their two territorial waters meet, but they meet exactly where the Cypriot waters are. And France has taken Cyprus's side on this. And last year, there was a Turkish ship heading towards Libya, which the French could interdict because for weapons smuggling. And there was a Turkish warship by it, and the Turkish warship locked its radar onto the French warship, meaning it's targeting it. You know, that's the thing you do before you press fire. Two NATO countries, that's how
dicey things are. That reminds me of the great anecdote of this guy in the Soviet Union. I lost his name, but he saw a blip on his radar screen, right? And he sort of took it upon himself to not initiate the auto response nuke codes. I'm sure you're familiar with this anecdote. I forget all the details of it.
No, I'm not. I'm just thinking.
Okay, no. Well, then you should certainly look it up. And it's frustrating I don't remember the guy's name, but supposedly he was sitting there in one of these observation towers, however it worked in the Soviet Union, and he saw what looked like an incoming attack on his radar. And he has, he's within the Soviet system, right? So he's a very strong protocol, which he must follow at all fucking costs. And he, as the story goes, he double checked that it was the attack that this radar was telling him it was before he passed it up the chain of command. And him doing that double check, I mean, changed the course of history, supposedly, because a good Soviet soldier doesn't double check. He just sends it up the chain and off, it's gone. There's no getting it back at that stage.
Yeah, that's an interesting connected point is the culture. And I mean, in Western culture, there is a degree up to a point of taking your initiative. It's not like that in some systems. It's so rigid. You're so frightened of, of taking initiative. Nothing ever gets done, or mistakes are made. That looks like it was almost one of them. I've just been writing recently about a similar sort of scenarios, but in space, because I think that's what's coming now. Killer satellites, they're already there. The Russians tested one last year. They clearly fired a projectile from a satellite at another satellite. The first time it's thought that it's been done in space, and did it in proximity to an American satellite as well. Mistakes up there may be mistaken for precursors to massive wars, because the future war will try to take out your opponent's satellites that can see everything that's happening on the ground. And if you do that, there is a danger that there's suddenly one side is blind, and it might panic and think there could be a nuclear attack coming. Sure. I think that this is one of the danger areas we're heading to, but we've always had.
There is more to say about the Arctic, but I do want to move on to the bottom of the world. So we go from the top to the bottom. Australia has missed out in the analysis. And I just wanted to ask you, when I write a chapter on my blog for Australia, very much in the style that you've written for Prisoners of Geography, what are the main things I have to include? What can I not omit?
Well, you know better than I do.
I very much doubt that.
Well, first of all, you're a bloody long way from anywhere. Although actually that's not exactly true, is it? But you look to your left, if I'm looking at the map, you look to your left, you got 6,000 miles before you hit the African coast. And you look to your right, you got 7,000 miles before you hit the Latin American or American coast. and you got 2,000 miles back that way before you hit New Zealand. Now, above you, yeah, so that's your focus.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, immediately you think, better have a navy.
Mm.
We haven't got a navy to keep the sea lanes open. Any fool could blockade us and we'll starve because we're not self-sufficient, especially in energy. So as soon as you look at the map, you think, better have a navy. Then where is the threat coming from? Nowhere, except up there.
You could say China's a pretty strong threat.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
we'll come to them, but in the first instance, it was Japan. And in those days, another thing immediately, we need a navy, but we need someone else's navy as well, the British. And you relied on the British. And then in 1941, your prime minister said very, very clearly in terms, we know London is not going to take care of us.
We're with the Yanks now.
The Japanese are just up there. Hi, America. And at that point, you jumped into the Americans' bed. And I don't blame you in the least. And the American, I think it was 150,000 US troops showed up into Darwin. Now it's China, but it's the same scenario. And America and you are natural allies for a number of reasons. Because, and that's why they've got the US Marine base up in, I think it's Darwin. And it's why, I don't know if you followed it recently, the Chinese are going to be opening a port in Papua New Guinea. Just for fishing. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, you just look at the map and you know what Australia's going to do. It needs a navy. It needs to not be blockaded, but it needs a bigger friend. And this century, there'll be another choice to make. You ditched us. You went with the Americans. This century, you've got another choice to make. You're going to ditch America and go with the Chinese, or are you going to stick with America? Big choice. So at the moment, it's pretty obvious what you're going to do, but things change over decades. What else about Australia? It's a shame. Once you go over the Blue Mountains, it's all desert. They genuinely didn't know, did they? There's a professor in 1920 at Sydney University, the first geography professor.
Okay.
And he said, by 2000, the maximum population in Australia, 20 million. And he was castigated for this because they had this idea of originally of sea to shining sea, like the Americans got over the Appalachians, through the fertile Midwest, over the Rockies. Fantastic. You got over the Blue Mountains, and, which is why you all live where you live.
Yeah, just bush.
But they still said, no, we can make a big deal out of this place, Australia, and grow the population. But it was around 20 million. What is it now? About 25.
22.
And
22, 23.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone a wee bit off topic, but you are growing.
No, you're directly on topic. It's Australia.
A finite amount of space. Look, I could talk about a lot more about Australia, but you like everybody else, you are liberated and constrained by your geography. There's only one place to live. Mostly, it's that curve, and that's where the rivers are. That's the Murray-Darling Basin. Only one of which you can't get very far up it. That is where Australians live and will continue to live despite all the technology. You are a continent, but you're also I don't know the word for it. You're also a crescent.
Yeah. Two interesting things came to mind while you were saying that, but I just want to also say I think it's the case that only 5% of our land is arable, so we just have giant space, but you can't do much with much of it except store things and mine things. But you can't grow things and you can't live. And
on the plus side, you had the coal, which of course now you're in two mines for obvious reasons about it. And I think is it lithium? You've got some.
Yeah, we got lithium. We got iron ore. We've got uranium.
You are the lucky country, but
for sure we are.
And also the territory also gives you some protection against invasion, because what's the point?
Yeah,
you can have a navy strong enough to protect that crescent. So if somebody wants to land in Darwin, well, they've got 2,000 miles before they get to anybody. notwithstanding the good people of Darwin.
Such a good theme as well, and I've left that for the last question. But you made very obvious there the importance of the geography of a place in determining these things, because it's much bigger than just the politics. But two things that came to mind: natural allies. I'd like you to just expand on that for a bit. But first, you mentioned all the rivers are there in Sydney, and this is also a theme throughout Prison of Geography. You say in Africa, they've got the most beautiful rivers in the world, but you fall off a cliff every couple of kilometers. So what use are they? Because obviously, and then America, on the other hand, has these perfect rivers for transport, and England, Britain, sorry, likewise, perfect rivers for transport. So
Give it time.
I wonder, are rivers still that important though? Because I mean, aren't trains rivers of their own, and we can sort of just more efficiently build our rivers? I mean, I'm not suggesting a canal, I'm more suggesting a train, but it's primarily for transport, right? Or is it all the water aspect as well?
Well, it's both, and you have a point that trains have taken the strain, but not much of it. But I don't know the figures off the top of my head when you break them down, but I know that 90% of the world's trade is carried on water. Even now, 90% is carried on water. And obviously a lot of that is the waterways, the internal canals, the rivers, etc., because then it remains so much cheaper to go by water. Obviously it's slower. So it still is extremely important, and I've actually forgotten the question.
Natural allies.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah. I'd say you were natural allies for a number of reasons. I mean, the history of Australia and its demographics, is obviously because of Britain and Ireland and other places in Europe. But increasingly, your demographics are changing, but your politics isn't particularly. You remain a very strong democracy. And so even if the demographics change, and you will no longer look back to the old country as much as you do, why would you? But if you're creating a modern, multicultural, multi-ethnic, democratic Australia, you're less likely to ally with China. You will ally with fellow democracies, which are America.
That's what I was wondering. Just that
firepower to protect you.
Yeah.
And you have the same mindset. But also, I think Japan.
Okay.
I think they're a natural ally for you.
Are they a natural ally because they're not an ally to China? Is that a big part of this?
Well, yes, that's very much part of it. But it's also because they're a democracy.
Okay.
I mean, there are limits to this. I'm sure Turkey, all through when it was a dictatorship, when the colonels took over, it carried on being a NATO member. Sorry, but Japan, yeah, you're probably familiar with the Quad. India, Australia, Japan, America. This is the Quad that frames the Indo-Pacific region. And the Quad is increasingly, it's an informal agreement between the four countries, mostly the four countries' navies. But it's one that's growing in importance, and it is vis-a-vis the four relationships with China, all of which are not particularly good. And so the Quad precedes the last couple of years' serious difficulty with China, but the difficulties have strengthened the Quad. There's even something called the Quad Plus now. They're trying to get South Korea and maybe others into it.
Sure.
And I just think when you look at the geopolitics and then you look at the map, the Quad makes perfect sense, because in the middle of it is China.
Yeah. So I've said a few times in this podcast that Taiwan will sort of be the political moment of my generation. Much for my parents' generation, maybe it was the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example. So whether it's a China aggression or a Taiwan liberation, I think Taiwan will really be the political moment of my generation. So how much am I wrong with that preamble to assert that China are the pests of the world?
The pests, did you say?
Yeah, the pests.
Ooh. And what in the this is a problem. What do we do? Yeah, do we stand back? Or do we defend them? I'm fascinated to see if the Brits, put their new aircraft carrier through the South China Sea this year, because the Americans might like them to. I mean, what's it for? I hadn't thought of it in those terms, and I think that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, just seismic. One of the defining moments of the previous century. If China was to take Taiwan back militarily, it would be a bloodbath on both sides. I mean, you kind of think, oh, little Taiwan, and it is compared to the gigantic China. But when you look at their firepower, Taiwan's firepower, especially its defensive firepower, oh my God, it's incredible. It would be a bloodbath for the Chinese to take it. I'm not saying they wouldn't. They've probably got a lot of people that they think are expendable. We've all done that in our past histories. We did.
But also,
that's another story.
Yeah. But there's also that implication as well, though it'd be a bloodbath between the Taiwanese and the Chinese, but it would almost trigger a Western reinforcement, would it not?
Yes. The current arrangement is that if it's an aggression by China, first of all, Taiwan mustn't declare full independence. That's the agreement they have with America. Unless they declare full independence, America will come to Taiwan's aid if there is an attack.
Okay.
If Taiwan declares independence and China attacks, America, if it chooses, can say,
wow. No. That's so interesting how that would be drawn up at the negotiation table. It's like, that's America trying to hedge their bets. Like, we really don't want a war, so these are the terms.
But China, clearly, its military stance is that it is positioning itself at some point to be able to do it. Being able to do it and doing it are two different things. But they're clearly positioning their military to be able to do it. And you look at their amphibious assault, the amount of money they put into amphibious assault training, etc. And they're getting aircraft carrier. Well, they've got 1.5, 2 aircraft carrier groups now. So, I mean, they will not give up their dream. They intend to get Taiwan back this century. It doesn't mean that they will. But a big part of this is the attitude of the Quad countries, especially the Americans. And at the moment, the Americans are minded to stand by Taiwan. It's not just because of Taiwan, with which they have an excellent relationship. It's to do more as well with keeping the international sea lanes open, pushing back against the Chinese pushing out. It's very worth looking. There's a map that you can get that looks at the world looking westward from China's perspective, as if you're standing on the Chinese coast looking that way.
Oh, okay.
Out. And what you see in front of you, if you're Chinese, is a wall, which they're 9-line dash, they call it. And it's Japan, and it's Taiwan, and it's the Philippines. And they see a wall in front of them, all of which are American allies. And to really control the region, they need to get past that wall. And Taiwan is part of that. And if you give up that, you've just opened up a huge brick in that wall. So it's not just about standing by our plucky little friends from Taiwan. It's about that bigger picture of not blinking and not allowing China to say, this is our area, not yours. So America at the moment is not going to change its stance of keeping the international sea lanes open, if necessary, by force. China is not going to give up its dream of pushing the Americans away and taking Taiwan. And yes, in your lifetime, the crunch will come. And if neither side blinks, the wall will come. But if there's a compromise, both sides will try and reach it.
I suppose optimistically for Taiwan, you perhaps I don't know what's the right way to say this. You're bittersweet in what the coronavirus has sort of done to China's relationship with the world, because it has, in my estimation, sort of weakened their soft power, definitely, but even also maybe their actual power, and the Western narrative really changing from China is just a country that's trying to do the best for their people and raise them out of poverty. How amazing is that? Sure, maybe they've got these weird customs, but that's okay. So be it. We have our weird customs too. To now, it's like, wait a minute, they're pretty imperialistic, and if they had no consequences facing them, they might do some terrible things. That's just my estimation of how the narrative has sort of shifted. And
Well, I agree with everything you said up until imperialistic. Although, that's a difficult word, because what does it mean in the 21st century? Does it mean you go and grab a piece of land and take it in Africa? No, I mean, it has changed, hasn't it? The idea of imperialism. Well, let's come back to that in a minute. No, you're absolutely right. I thought China played it quite well for the first month or so, when their lies that they were telling, we believed it. And they did give the genome sequencing. They handed that over very quickly, which thank God they did, otherwise we might not even have some of these vaccines. I don't know. Excuse me. But then it became apparent over the following 6, 7, 8 months, A, that they'd been lying through their teeth, B, that they were covering it up, C, that all this soft power kit they were giving to like Italy and places. I mean, the EU was absolutely in disarray. The Italians were begging Brussels to enact, to trigger a law that they have. And Brussels refused. And so Italy didn't get any help for months. And so China said, we'll help you. And it was a great bit of soft power until, well, all the kit they sent didn't work. Same with the kit they sent to the Brits.
Is that a fact? I didn't see that. I thought they were just like...
look, some of it did, and some of it was done perhaps for genuine altruistic reasons, but a lot of it was simply soft power. And then if you're gonna do soft power, get it right. They didn't. They got it wrong, because half the kit didn't work. And so a lot of people were like, And then across the year, you saw them also using the COVID crisis as cover. The incident with India, where dozens of Indian troops were killed. In fact, quite a few Chinese troops were killed in hand-to-hand fighting, which you kind of think is guns and bayonets. No, it was fists and clubs on the border. Dozens died on each side in a mass brawl. But this is because the Chinese had moved across the demarcation line, but they were using, the world's attention was elsewhere. They sank a fishing vessel, I think it was, it doesn't really matter, except to the people on it. But they sank that. They sailed a carrier group right around Taiwan. I think it was the first. They did a whole bunch of stuff. Knowing that everyone else was busy. And then there was the sanctions against Australia for daring to say that the Chinese had done X, Y, and Z with COVID. And then suddenly you get I think it was the barley, the wheat, all these sanctions piled in on Australia. And what happened across the globe is that people started to pay more attention to China and what it's doing and its soft power. And there's been a flurry of stories over here in the past 6 months about their inroads into our universities. Huawei, the 5G phone company, initially we said we would accept them, and now we've reversed it. And that's
have you? Okay, nice.
Well. So a whole bunch of stuff in the past 6 months. A lot of people have woken up to how China is trying to dominate the world. I'm not blaming the Chinese for it. Every great power tries to dominate the world, which brings us briefly back to imperialism. They are not an imperialistic country the way that the Brits were, or indeed the Japanese. They don't intend to occupy.
You don't think so?
Places and say we are the sovereign power here now, or at least the protecting power. But yeah, they are absolutely, when it comes to places like Africa, moving into African countries, dominating it commercially, bringing in thousands of their own workers instead of employing local people, putting in what they say are volunteers, but are in fact Chinese police officers as security guards. It's a form of imperialism. And then a subject I know you know something about, which is the debt diplomacy. I mean, Sri Lankan port is the best example. Yes, certainly we will lend you all this money to build the port, and knowing full well you can't pay it back.
Exactly.
And when you can't pay it back,
so it's ours.
They're doing it. It's not. They're doing it. Look, the Brits did things like that as well. I'm not saying they're inherently evil or anything, but they are behaving in this manner.
What makes it evil, right? Or just what what separates it from maybe the way people think about how the Brits did it, or the French, or even the Americans in Latin America. Like I think what separates it is the fact that we have a bit of an insight into the Chinese culture. Matthew Tai runs this fantastic YouTube channel, and he's an American who lived in China for a very long time and sort of got chased out of there a while ago. But
How do you
he
spell his
has
name?
Matthew Tai,
T-I-
Tye, last name.
Oh, yes, yes, I have heard of him. Yeah.
Yeah, he should be coming on the podcast soon. So it will be
Right.
good to talk to him about exclusively this. But it's like a look into China's culture, right? The sort of decimation of the actual ethnic minorities that live in the country and the
Oh,
actual
God, yeah.
microcultures that live in the country. The fact that education is, I mean, it's a completely authoritarian state, right?
Yes.
China thinks of people as Chinese or foreign, right? You know,
Yes.
you could be Vietnamese and walk into China, and Australian and walk into China, but we're both foreigners. There is a racism to that, because there is also the
Yes.
China is a superior culture narrative. And so anyway, that's a bit of preamble to say that because we sort of know these things about China, there is a different paint with which these debt trap diplomacies are brushed. For example, in Africa, if the United States was financing the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, I'd feel very differently about it than the fact that the Chinese are financing it. As at one example, what do you make of that?
I find it problematic, to use the modern word, because I know where you're coming from. China is not doing what it's doing around the world for everyone else's benefit. Far from it. But it is behaving in a way that we used to behave, perhaps some elements of it we still do. But British imperialism had incredibly dark moments. The massacre at Amritsar, well, basically taking other people's territory and getting all their riches for decades. So I hesitate to think that we were better in our imperial phase than China. I mean, there was the probably racist element of the civilizing effect, and there are some good end results of building railway networks and things and education, but it's a very hard argument to make about the positive side of it. So I don't think that we were necessarily any better than China.
Sure.
I think what we have done in the past few decades is learned more about our behaviors and our crimes, and I think we would be hard pushed to repeat them, even if we could. I don't think we would try to do that, because I don't think we have quite the same attitudes anymore to different peoples. We've come a long way, not far enough. And I doubt China. China hasn't been on that journey.
Sure.
There is a very, very strong strain of Chinese nationalism. Well, I should say Han nationalism, because there are many different Chinese. There's Mongolian Chinese, and Tibetan Chinese, and the Uyghurs Chinese. But the Han, ethnically, is an exceptionally strong strain of nationalism within the Han, and it shows when they go to African countries and elsewhere, and they do their economic deals, and they are not interested in workers' rights, and they're not interested in saying to the government, "Great, we'd love to do business with you, but we do have an issue with what's happening with these political prisoners," or whatever. And
right.
Western foreign policy, for all its hypocrisy and its problems, does actually try to at least do some good as it moves
and net good,
world. And that just is not part of the Communist Party and the Chinese way of thinking at all. I'm not painting us as saints, but I think it is justifiable to try to tie international trade with human rights, and that is just simply not on their radar.
I think a good example of an infrastructure project that they're involved in that might highlight this the best is now it hasn't been built, but the Chinese Nicaraguan canal, which I read about
Yeah,
in your book, I believe. So this is objectively a atrocious thing to do to the environment. You know, you just cut a half pipe through some of the thickest jungle in the world, right? It's connect a hot and a cold ocean into a freshwater lake. It's disaster on every single level, and but there's economic upside for doing it, right? So if we look at it through the say the British lens or the Chinese lens, which I don't think we necessarily have to, but just if you did for the sake of argument, we'd look at that and say if it was a British private firm behind it, people would be like, wait a minute, is the economic upside worth the catastrophic environmental damage you're going to do there? And you would literally chop the country in half. What about all the what about all the displacement? You know,
there would be a consideration, but up to a point, my lad. Our companies are also, British Petroleum, for all the greening that it's doing, is still also doing all sorts of things. And the French are in Niger because they need the uranium, the green yellowcake, to keep the lights on in France.
Mm.
And the working conditions in Niger are absolutely appalling. I think the bigger difference is that if a British company was doing something like that, let's say that the canal project, which as you say is probably not going to go ahead now, they've got a few hundred meters in each side, and we got to hear about it, our environmental movements, which are growing, would be up in arms about it, and the moral pressure would translate into political pressure on the government and on the companies. In China, forget it. They just don't have that because it's closed society. So, it's delicate, isn't it? We're both treading slightly on dangerous ground because it's very easy to talk about these things as if we're all, in the 21st century, brilliant, wonderful.
Like we understand the complexity.
We're not, but I do think we have different standards.
Okay, Tim. This is a baseline that I ask all the guests. What two people would you witness a conversation between in history? Any people you want, dead or alive?
Oh man. Moses and Jesus.
Okay. Look, it's pretty much, it's impossible to not give a great answer for that kind of question, but that would be fascinating.
Also, give me a few more minutes and I'll come up with about 10 different examples. But I just love, Moses saying, look, it's written here, and Jesus saying, yeah, but I just want to tweak this bit here.
Yeah. What country are you most bullish on in the immediate future?
Do you mean
if you could invest in a country, what's gonna give you the biggest returns?
Ooh.
And not like
Vietnam.
Okay, cool. Do you want to explain why quickly?
Like the Chinese, they're pretending to be communists, but they're not.
Okay.
And when you have control to that degree, and you're a capitalist, you can make things happen. I am not defending it. I'm not thinking it's a good idea, be simply on the investing, which I wouldn't do, but if I could. And as a last thought, it's another reason why we need to defend democracy and actually realize the benefits of it, because it's taking some pretty heavy knocks at the moment, because this is the point. The Chinese have shown that it was wrong to say, as we did for a whole century, only a democratic capitalist country can be economically successful, because they have a dictatorial, closed, one-party state, and their economy has been a roaring success. It's got lots of structural faults, but so do they all. They have lifted 400 million people out of poverty. Amazing achievement. There's 700 million in poverty, but 400 million is lifted. And they've proved that model wrong. And consequently, the message around the world is you don't need to be a liberal democracy to be successful, as we saw all the successful liberal democracies of the 20th century. And that really damages democracy. So despite saying, yeah, I think Vietnam will be potentially successful, I'm not supporting that as a model. I do think that this liberal democracy is the best system tried so far, and you lose it at your peril.
Well, Tim Marshall, what an absolute pleasure. I can't believe you got to come on. I haven't asked you about your new book.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
So it's due in April. Do you want to tell us about it?
Look, I only had it here simply to raise the microphone to a higher level. You know, it wasn't here to actually show you. It's the follow-up. After 5 years and 4 different books, it's the follow-up to Prisoners of Geography, Power of Geography. And it looks at a lot of the regions we didn't get to in the first book. And if you're wondering how I knew all that arcane stuff about your own countries, because the first chapter is about Australia.
Perfect. Well,
and the last chapter is about space. And that's my favorite chapter, probably.
I'll include the link to that Waterstone special where you get the globe. You're going running for the globe. Yeah. So
is it worth 1,300?
Oh mate, this is plastic. I'd love one of those Bellaby ones. It looks amazing, but well out of my price range.
Me too.
See you later,
Thank
Tim.
you.
Thanks, mate.